December 27, 1944. The Pacific sky burned with the slow fire of sunset, streaks of orange bleeding into violet, the clouds torn and frayed by days of battle. Somewhere over Leyte Gulf, a single P-38 Lightning sliced through the horizon like a twin-bladed spear, its engines humming with the confidence of a machine that knew its pilot's touch better than his own heartbeat. Inside the cockpit, Major Richard Ira Bong adjusted his throttle with the calm precision of a man tuning a violin. Below him, the ocean stretched endlessly, glittering with the faint reflection of a war that had devoured everything it touched. To many, this was just another day of combat. To Bong, it was the day he would mark his 40th confirmed kill, the day America's most unassuming son secured his place in history. He was not supposed to be here anymore. Headquarters had tried to pull him back from the front several times already, insisting that his luck would eventually break. But Bong was not a gambler. He was an observer. His comrades said he flew with the patience of a hunter and the focus of a surgeon. In his logbook, his handwriting was small and neat, his tone unemotional. Enemy fighter destroyed. No damage to aircraft. To read it, one might think he had swatted a mosquito instead of sending another plane spiraling into the sea. Yet beneath the restraint was a quiet defiance, the same that had carried him from the frozen farmlands of Wisconsin to the burning skies of the Pacific. Richard Bong had grown up on a small dairy farm in Poplar, a place so peaceful that the sound of a tractor engine was the day's greatest excitement. His father milked cows before dawn, his mother baked bread that filled the house with warmth, and the boy who would one day terrify Japanese pilots spent his evenings building model airplanes from balsa wood. He would watch birds circle over the fields and try to mimic their turns, studying the physics of flight long before he ever touched a control stick. He once told a classmate, "I just want to know how it feels to move like that." When war erupted across the world, that curiosity turned into calling. By 1941, the Army Air Corps was hungry for young men who could handle the complexity of modern aircraft. Bong joined without hesitation, his shy smile hiding the restless energy that burned inside him. He trained in California, where the sun was brighter, the planes faster, and the instructors harsher. One of them, Captain Kenny, later General George C. Kenny, remembered Bong as quiet to the point of invisibility until he got into the air. Then he was transformed. During training, Bong developed a reputation for precision flying, but also for pushing boundaries. He once buzzed a student dormitory so low that laundry flew off the lines. When called in for discipline, he stood at attention, expression blank, and said, "Sir, the plane needed fresh air." Kenny grounded him for a week, and recommended him for advanced fighter training. When Bong first saw the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, he thought it looked like something from another world. Twin engines, twin tails, and a cockpit perched between them like the head of a hawk. Most pilots found it difficult, even dangerous. Its torque could twist unwary flyers into the sea. But Bong saw potential. "It's not a plane," he said, "it's a pair of wings trying to outrun each other." He spent hours studying its angles, learning its quirks. He noted how it climbed faster than the Japanese Zero, how its guns were mounted in the nose for perfect convergence. He treated it less as a machine and more as a living partner. It would become his greatest ally, and the silent witness to every risk he ever took. By the time he reached the 9th Fighter Squadron in New Guinea in 1942, the war in the Pacific was chaos. Jungle heat melted the line between exhaustion and madness. Pilots went up and never came back. Japanese Zeros owned the sky, nimble and ruthless. The Americans were learning the hard way that bravery was not enough. One needed calculation, anticipation, and a bit of nerve. Bong learned quickly. His first confirmed kill came in December 1942, when he dove on a formation of enemy fighters from above the clouds. He waited, motionless, until the lead plane filled his gun sight, then fired a 2-second burst. The Zero exploded into orange flame. Bong didn't cheer. He simply pulled up and looked for the next target. When he landed, his mechanic asked how it felt. Bong shrugged and said, "The lightning worked fine." That composure unnerved even his comrades. Some thought he lacked emotion, others believed he hit it too well. But what they all agreed on was that Bong saw air combat differently. Where most pilots fought with adrenaline, he fought with equations. He measured distances instinctively, used the sun's position to blind opponents, and relied on short, controlled bursts rather than wild sprays of bullets. He never chased a fleeing enemy, too risky, too wasteful. "Let them run," he'd say, "they'll have to turn eventually." It was this blend of patience and audacity that earned him victories no one else could replicate. By late 1943, Bong had shot down more aircraft than any American pilot in the Pacific. His legend began to circulate through both Allied and Japanese ranks. Intercepted radio chatter revealed Japanese pilots referring to him as the White Devil with twin tails. Yet Bong remained modest, almost indifferent to his fame. He wrote letters home about weather, food, and boredom more often than about combat. To his fiancée, Marjorie, he sent sketches of clouds and jokes about military coffee. "The sky's still blue," he once wrote, "but I think it's getting tired of me." Still, beneath his calm exterior, a quiet conflict brewed. Each mission carried a weight that no metal could balance. He had seen friends vanish in smoke, their last words swallowed by static. He had watched planes burning over jungles too dense for rescue. And every time he returned alive, he felt both relief and guilt. "Maybe," he told one squad mate, "I'm just luckier at staying scared." His method of survival, this strange, deliberate way of flying, was born not of arrogance but of fear he had learned to control. That evening of December 27th, as Bong's P-38 roared over Leyte, the radio crackled with reports of enemy activity. He spotted 2 Japanese fighters below, their silver wings catching the dying sun. He dove, cutting through clouds like a blade through silk. The enemy scattered, he chose one and fired. In less than 4 seconds, the plane disintegrated into smoke. Bong banked away, scanning for others. There were none. His 40th victory had come and gone like a breath. No celebration, no shouting, only the steady hum of engines carrying him home. When he landed, ground crew rushed to meet him. Someone cheered. Another held up 4 fingers, then made a 0. Bong smiled faintly but said nothing. He removed his gloves, wiped the sweat from his palms, and walked toward the tent. That night, while others toasted his achievement, he sat quietly writing in his journal. "Shot down 1 enemy fighter today. Weather fair. Plane performed well." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, 40. "Enough, I think." Outside, the jungle hummed with the sound of insects, indifferent to heroes and headlines. Somewhere above the dark canopy, the stars hung motionless, reflecting off the metal skin of AP-38 that had earned its rest. For Bong, the war was far from over, yet something within him had already begun to change. He didn't know it yet, but the sky he had mastered was preparing to test him in ways no enemy ever could. The new year of 1945 began with a thin mist over the Philippines, the kind that blurred the line between sea and sky. The war was turning, but no one in the Pacific dared to say it aloud. In the camps and airfields scattered across Leyte, exhaustion hung heavier than the heat. Major Richard Ira Bong, now a household name back home, walked among his men with a quiet detachment. He wore no sign of rank beyond his wings and his habit of speaking softly, as if even his words could draw enemy fire. His P-38, Marge, named after his fiancée, stood gleaming under a tarp streaked with oil and dust. Each patch of metal on its fuselage told a story, 40 small flags, painted carefully beneath the cockpit, each marking a life ended in the air. To his superiors, Bong was both a symbol and a problem. General Kenny, his old mentor and now commander of the 5th Air Force, wanted to keep him alive. The press called Bong America's ace of aces, the smiling Midwestern boy who had shot down more Japanese planes than anyone else. But Kenny saw the fatigue in Bong's eyes, the tremor in his hands when he lit a cigarette. "You've done enough, Dick," he told him during a meeting inside the sweltering operations tent. "Washington needs heroes, not martyrs." Bong only nodded, staring at the map spread across the table, red pins marking airfields, blue for Allied positions. His voice was calm but distant. "Sir, I just want to finish the job." Finishing the job meant flying, and flying meant living in that strange space between life and death, where thought vanished and instinct ruled. Bong's squadron had been reassigned to cover ground troops pushing north through Luzon. The Japanese, desperate and cornered, fought with a ferocity born of despair. Kamikaze attacks had become daily occurrences. Each morning, the airfield trembled as suicide pilots dove toward American ships in the Gulf. Bong stood beside his Lightning, listening to the dull rumble of distant impacts, and wondered how many of those men had been forced into the cockpit with promises of glory. He could respect courage even in an enemy. What he could not understand was waste, the kind of death that meant nothing. He was supposed to stop flying combat missions, at least officially. Orders had come down from General MacArthur's staff that Bong was to serve as an instructor and morale officer, giving talks, demonstrating maneuvers, posing for photographs. The military photographers loved him, clean-cut, modest, the perfect American flyer. But every time the camera flashed, Bong felt like he was stepping further from the sky. On the ground, he was restless, a ghost haunting his own legend. "You can't cage a hawk and ask it to sing," one of his pilots said. Bong didn't hear him, but the truth of it hung in the air. His only moments of ease came when he spoke with Marjorie through letters. Her handwriting was smooth and graceful, filled with the gentle patience of someone who believed love could outlast distance and war. She wrote about snow falling in Wisconsin, about her work at the school, about how everyone back home spoke of him like he was already part of history. Bong read her words under the light of a flickering lantern, his face softening for the first time in days. He wrote back, though less often, unsure how to describe what he felt. "It's strange," he wrote once, "to be surrounded by so many men and still feel like I'm the only one up here." The conflict within him grew heavier each day. He had survived longer than most, defied odds that should have ended him a dozen times over. Yet survival had become its own burden. Each mission blurred into the next, every victory a reminder of how many friends he had buried. His squadron's mess tent was quieter now. The laughter had faded, replaced by the clink of metal cups and the occasional burst of forced optimism. Bong had stopped keeping track of names in his logbook. Too many ended with a small cross in the margin. One morning, as dawn broke over the jungle, Bong received an envelope marked urgent. Inside was a letter signed by General Kenny himself. He was to return to the United States immediately. His combat service was over. The words were final. Bong stared at the page for several minutes before folding it neatly and slipping it into his jacket pocket. That evening, he stood beside Marge one last time, running his hand along the nose art. A smiling woman with blonde curls, painted from a photograph of Marjorie. The paint was chipped, the edges worn by rain and heat. "We made it, old girl," he whispered to the aircraft. "We made it home." 2 days later, Bong boarded a transport plane bound for San Francisco. As the engines roared to life, he glanced out the window at the airfield shrinking below him, the streaks of mud and grass blurring into green. For the first time in years, he was leaving the war behind. But the quiet that followed was unsettling. The Pacific had been brutal, but it had given his life rhythm, purpose, a reason to wake before dawn. Now, the silence of peace felt almost unbearable. When he stepped off the plane in California, reporters swarmed him like flies to honey. Flashbulbs popped, microphones thrust forward, voices shouting questions about his heroic exploits. Bong smiled politely, his words measured, almost rehearsed. "I was just doing my duty," he said. But behind his composure, he felt the ground tilt slightly beneath his feet. America had turned him into an icon, a symbol of courage and victory. Yet he could not explain that courage had come not from fearlessness, but from fear mastered over and over again. Within weeks, he found himself standing beside President Truman at a White House ceremony, receiving the Medal of Honor. Cameras captured his hesitant smile, his modest bow. Truman called him a true American hero. Bong's parents, simple farmers from Wisconsin, stood beside him in quiet disbelief. His mother clutched the medal as if afraid it might vanish. His father looked at his son's uniform, the ribbons, the golden wings, and said softly, "You've done your part, Richie. Come home and rest." But rest did not come easily. The Army assigned him to flight testing with Lockheed in Burbank, helping evaluate new jet aircraft for the post-war Air Force. The job was safe compared to combat, yet it carried a different kind of danger, the cold, technical risk of machines not yet understood. Bong accepted the assignment, partly out of duty, partly because he could not imagine a life without the hum of engines. "I just want to fly," he told Marjorie, now his fiancée in truth. She nodded, though her eyes betrayed a quiet dread. She had already waded through years of war. She did not want to wait through peacetime too. Still, Bong believed he could bridge the two worlds, the old and the new, the war and whatever came after. On weekends, he visited Marjorie, spoke at war bond rallies, signed autographs for children who saw him as larger than life. But at night, he often sat awake, listening to the sound of distant planes taking off from the test field. Each roar pulled at something deep inside him, something that refused to be silenced. He didn't know it yet, but fate was already circling back toward him, as if the sky itself could not let him go. The Pacific had spared him, but the engines of peace were less forgiving. In the twilight of that winter, as America celebrated victory, Major Richard Ira Bong was about to face his final test, not against an enemy pilot, but against the very force that had defined him since boyhood, the irresistible call of flight. The spring of 1945 found California wrapped in sunshine and celebration. Victory banners still fluttered from lampposts, and people smiled at strangers in the street, grateful that the long nightmare was ending. But inside a small hangar at Lockheed Airfield in Burbank, the war was not quite over. Rows of sleek, silver aircraft lined the runway, their pointed noses and swept tails whispering of a new age, the jet age. Major Richard Ira Bong stood beside one of them, his flight jacket unzipped, a clipboard tucked under his arm. The airplane before him, the P-80 Shooting Star, looked unlike anything he had ever flown. Its skin gleamed without a propeller to break the air. Beneath the metal surface lay a single roaring engine, a British design adapted by American engineers to push the limits of speed. Bong ran his hand along the fuselage, as though greeting an old friend disguised in new clothes. "She's fast," said one of the engineers nearby. "Maybe too fast." Bong smiled faintly. That's what they said about the Lightning. The Army Air Forces had chosen Bong as a test pilot precisely because he understood risk. He was cautious, methodical, and carried the quiet confidence of someone who had survived every kind of danger a man could face in the sky. Yet this was different. In the Pacific, he had fought against flesh and blood, pilots he could see, maneuver against, outthink. Now, his adversary was invisible, the unknown behavior of a machine built to defy the air itself. Test flights were not glamorous. They involved endless data sheets, mechanical inspections, and the patience to repeat maneuvers that could kill with a single malfunction. Still, Bong found a strange peace in the work. There was no enemy, no gunfire, no radio chatter. Just the low hum of turbines and the endless Californian horizon. Marjorie visited often, carrying sandwiches and a smile that could steady him. They had finally married that February, a small ceremony attended by family and a few military friends. For once, Bong had seemed content, laughing softly as he fumbled with the wedding ring. "You're grounded now, mister," Marjorie had teased. But even as she said it, she knew he couldn't be. Flying wasn't his job, it was his bloodstream. Each day, as he prepared for another test, she watched from the fence, her hands clasped tight around the metal wire, silently praying the sound of engines would not end in silence. The men at Lockheed admired him. He never bragged, never pulled rank. When younger pilots asked how he'd managed 40 victories, he shrugged. "I missed fewer times than they did," he'd say, with a half-smile that made them laugh but never quite answered the question. To Bong, the secret wasn't in daring. It was in calmness, in knowing that panic was death's ally. The trick, he once told a mechanic while checking the Shooting Star's tail assembly, is to be scared just enough to stay sharp. But sharpness couldn't stop what no one yet fully understood. Jet propulsion was a new frontier, and the P-80's early models were notoriously temperamental. One minor oversight, a loose fuel line, an unstable compressor, could turn the aircraft into a fireball. Engineers warned of unpredictable surges during takeoff and landing. Bong read the reports carefully but trusted the system. He had always believed that machines, like people, responded to respect and discipline. Before each test, he went through the same ritual: a slow walk around the aircraft, a gentle tap on the fuselage, and a brief pause to adjust his gloves. "All right, girl," he would whisper, "let's see what you've got." By summer, he was logging dozens of flight hours, helping refine the jet's performance. Lockheed's chief engineer, Tony McGuire, often flew alongside him. McGuire once remarked that Bong handled the 80 like a man listening to music, every motion smooth, deliberate. Yet even the best ears could miss a discordant note. On one flight, Bong experienced a sudden flameout over the San Fernando Valley. The jet's engine coughed, then went silent. For 10 long seconds, he glided through empty air before the turbine roared back to life. When he landed, his first words were calm: "Guess she wanted a nap." The crew laughed, but Marjorie later admitted she couldn't sleep for days after hearing it. Despite these incidents, the Army planned a public demonstration of the P-80, a symbol of post-war progress. The date was set for August 6, 1945. Bong was to perform a routine acceptance flight, ensuring the jet was ready for official presentation. That morning he ate breakfast quietly at home, still in his flight suit. Marjorie kissed him goodbye at the door. "You'll be home for dinner?" she asked. He smiled, "Always." It was a promise he had made hundreds of times before, and each one had come true, until now. At 2:30 p.m., Bong climbed into the cockpit of P-80A, serial number 44 to 85,048. Ground crew watched as he ran through the pre-flight checklist. Everything appeared normal. The weather was clear, visibility excellent. As he taxied down the runway, a faint shimmer of heat rose from the jet's exhaust. He gave a casual wave to the crew chief, then accelerated. The shooting star leapt forward, its engine howling with raw, mechanical power. For the first minute, the flight went smoothly. Then witnesses saw a thin trail of smoke. Seconds later, the jet began to lose altitude. Inside the cockpit, Bong's training took over. He radioed a brief message: calm, clipped, engine failure, attempting to bail. The canopy blew off, and his parachute deployed. But at only 300 feet, there wasn't enough time. The chute barely opened before the jet struck a house in North Hollywood, erupting in flames. It was 2:38 p.m., the same moment, halfway across the Pacific, that the Enola Gay dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. History had pivoted in two directions at once, one toward terrifying new power, the other toward silence. The explosion rattled windows for blocks. Neighbors rushed to the scene, pulling debris aside, shouting for survivors. They found Bong's body near the wreckage, his parachute still tangled around him. The irony was unbearable. America's greatest pilot killed not in war, but in peace, by the very progress he helped create. When the news reached Marjorie, she collapsed onto the kitchen floor, the coffee pot shattering beside her. Later that day, President Truman announced Japan's impending defeat. The newspapers the next morning carried two headlines side by side. Atomic bomb destroys Hiroshima and America's ace of aces killed in jet crash. In Wisconsin, the Bong family's farmhouse filled with reporters. His father read the telegram in silence, then folded it carefully and placed it on the mantel beside a photograph of his son in uniform. "He flew as long as God let him," he said simply. The nation mourned him quietly, overshadowed by the larger tides of history. Yet among pilots, his death hit like a thunderclap. Tony McGuire wept openly at the airfield, saying, "If Bong couldn't survive the jet, who could?" In the days that followed, Lockheed engineers discovered the cause: a fuel pump malfunction that starved the engine of power. A minor flaw, invisible until it was too late. They fixed it in later models, ensuring future pilots would live because Bong had not. It was, in a tragic way, his final act of service. Marjorie received the telegram confirming his death only hours before another arrived, his Medal of Honor citation, reissued by the War Department. She buried them together, side by side in a small wooden box. When she stood over his grave, she whispered words only he would have understood. "You finished the job, Richie." And yet, even in death, Bong's legend refused to rest. Pilots still spoke of him with a kind of reverence, not for his kills, but for his calm. He had mastered fear, and in doing so, taught others how to live with it. His story was more than statistics. It was the fragile truth of what courage really means, to keep flying even when the sky itself turns against you. The years that followed Richard Bong's death moved forward with the unrelenting rhythm of peacetime progress. Jet engines roared louder, airframes sleeker, and the world that had once been defined by propellers gave way to speed and silence. But amid that march of innovation, the memory of one quiet man from Wisconsin lingered like contrails fading across the sky. His name was carved into plaques, schools, and airfields, but to those who had known him, the engineers, the pilots, the girl who had waded through the war, he remained something more intimate. A symbol of calm in chaos, of purpose beyond fame. The public celebrated him as America's Ace of Aces, yet those who truly understood saw the contradiction in that title. Bong had never sought to be a killer. He had simply sought to fly. In Superior, Wisconsin, the Bong family farm still stood, its wooden beams weathered by years of snow and wind. His parents aged quietly, declining interviews, their grief too old to be reopened by curiosity. Sometimes children from the nearby school, named after their son, would ride their bicycles past the house, whispering stories they'd heard about the local boy who had become a legend. His mother, Dora, would wave through the window, her eyes soft but distant. On the mantel rested a photograph of Richard in uniform, smiling faintly beside his P-38 Marge. The metal beside it had dulled with time, yet it seemed to hold the light differently whenever the sun touched it, like a small piece of the sky refusing to fade. For Marjorie, widowhood came quietly, but it was no less cruel. She was 24 when she buried him, still wearing the dress she had chosen for their first anniversary. Reporters came at first, asking her to speak about the hero's final flight, but she declined them all. Her voice, she said, belonged only to him. She returned to teaching, to the rhythm of chalk and laughter, but her heart lived elsewhere. Each evening she wrote in a small journal, letters she would never send. "You would have loved how the world looks now," one entry read. "Faster planes, quieter skies. But none of them sound like yours." She never remarried. Instead, she devoted her life to aviation education, quietly funding scholarships in his name. Her students never knew that the woman at the front of the classroom had once held the hand of a man who shaped the sky. The Air Force, newly formed from the Army Air Forces in 1947, carried Bong's name like a banner. His calmness in combat, his discipline in flight, became doctrine. Training manuals quoted his understated advice: "Don't be a show-off. Shoot to live, not to impress." Young pilots memorized those words before ever touching a cockpit. In every briefing room, his photograph hung, eyes steady, expression humble. To the new generation of jet pilots, he represented something that technology could not replace: human steadiness. They called it Bong's principle, the idea that courage was less about daring and more about composure. Yet beyond the official honors, something deeper stirred. Bong's story became a paradox in America's memory, a hero who conquered war only to be claimed by peace. Historians argued over what his legacy meant. Was he a cautionary tale of progress outrunning its heroes, or a symbol of sacrifice that kept progress safe? The question lingered like an echo across the halls of museums and lecture rooms. One biographer called him the last man to truly see the sky as a battlefield and a dream. Perhaps it was true. By the 1950s, the world was entering an age where machines could outthink pilots, where flight was no longer a personal act of courage but a calculation. Bong had flown on instinct, on the pulse between heartbeats, where man and machine blurred into one. That intimacy, the human art of flight, was already vanishing. In 1954, a monument was erected near Poplar, Wisconsin, a full-scale replica of his P-38 Marge, mounted in a climbing position as though eternally taking off. Veterans gathered from across the country. General Kenny, older now, his hair turned white, stood at the podium. His voice trembled as he spoke. Richard Bong never fought for glory. He fought because someone had to. And when the war ended, he helped build the peace that followed. He lived fast but not recklessly, he lived deliberately. The crowd stood silent. Among them were dozens of pilots who had once flown under Bong's command. A few had been saved by his cover fire, others inspired by his patience. They saluted as the sun caught the metal wings of the replica, reflecting light across the field like a second dawn. In that moment, a strange calm settled. The monument wasn't just for Bong. It was for all the men who had carried their courage into the unknown. For Marjorie, who stood at the edge of the crowd, the sight was almost unbearable. The wind pressed against her dress, the same cold air that once roared past his cockpit. She whispered under her breath, "You're still flying, Richie." The words vanished into the sky, but something inside her loosened, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. Decades later, Bong's name would return to public consciousness in unexpected ways. A new generation discovered him through documentaries, declassified combat footage, and veterans' memoirs. Pilots spoke of him not in terms of kill counts, but of presence, how he seemed to make the impossible appear ordinary. Modern Air Force instructors would tell cadets, "If you want to know what professionalism looks like, study Richard Bong." The old black and white photos, his boyish grin, the confident tilt of his cap, became relics of an age where the measure of a man was not how loud he was, but how steady he could be when everything else was chaos. But perhaps the most enduring mark he left was invisible. The technology he helped test, the lessons learned from his final flight, directly influenced the safety of future jets. Every improved ejection system, every redundant fuel line, every engineering safeguard carried a small trace of his sacrifice. Engineers didn't call it that, of course. They spoke in terms of data and design. Yet in the quiet of the hangars, some of them kept his photograph pinned above their desks, a silent reminder that progress always comes with a cost. By the late 20th century, Bong's story had become both legend and lesson. His hometown museum displayed his medals, his letters, and fragments from the wreckage of the P-80 that ended his life. Visitors often paused before a small glass case containing a worn leather flight glove. The fabric was frayed, the stitching nearly gone, but the caption beneath it read simply, "Asterisk, used during final flight, 1945. Belonged to Major Richard I. Bong." Asterisk people lingered there, perhaps because it felt human, tangible proof that the hero they'd heard about was once just a man with calloused hands and a love for the sky. And so, history circled back as it always does. The boy from Wisconsin who once built model airplanes in a farmhouse workshop had become part of the very sky he dreamed of. His method of madness, his balance of daring and discipline, had turned into something larger than himself, a standard. Generations of aviators would chase his steadiness, never fully reaching it, but always trying. As evening settles over Wisconsin, the replica of Marge still catches the last light of the sun, its metal glowing gold before nightfall. The wind sighs through the trees, carrying with it the low hum of memory. Somewhere far above, in the boundless quiet, you might imagine a figure banking gently toward the horizon, steady hands on the controls, eyes fixed forward, the faintest smile on his lips. The world below forgets its noise for a moment. Because every time a pilot takes to the sky with calm courage in his heart, Richard Bong flies again. If you enjoyed this story and want more forgotten tales of courage, ingenuity, and sacrifice from the Second World War, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which hero's story you'd like to see next.